That's Arthur Aidala.
We have a very special guest today, Melissa DeRosa. She was the secretary to the governor of the state of New York and is now the author of the book, What's Left Unsaid, My Life at the Center of Power, Politics, and Crisis. And boy, was she at the center of power, politics, and crisis here in the state of New York. Before we get to hear from Melissa directly, let's hear what was said about her upon her resignation from that post.
Governor Cuomo now facing an uphill political battle without top aide and staunch defender Melissa DeRosa, who stepped down Sunday night.
Melissa should have resigned months ago and apologized along with the other enablers.
DeRosa has been a fixture in the Cuomo administration since 2013. She's mentioned dozens of times in the Attorney General's report for allegedly trying to retaliate against one of the governor's 11 accusers. DeRosa has been blamed for normalizing workplace harassment and previously came under fire in February for the state's nursing home scandal. Her late-night resignation statement does not mention Governor Cuomo by name. Quote, personally, the past 2 years have been emotionally and mentally trying.
So, Melissa, welcome. Thank you for finding the time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
As you know, I'm a trial attorney, and often in the courtroom, my job is I go first, and then I have to hear someone make statements like that, typically about my client, thereafter, and I don't get the opportunity to give a response. First and foremost, is this book a response to those people out there who, after your hard work for 10 years, didn't say the nicest things upon your resignation?
You know, it's not. I mean, I decided I was going to write the book 24 hours after we were out of office because I said I was not going to let the first draft of history stand. And the first draft of history was written by reporters during the fog of COVID during those 2 years. That it was done mostly not through primary sources, people who weren't in the room, a lot of people with particular political and personal motivations. And I lived it. I was in the room, I was there, I was on the phone with Jared Kushner, I was on the phone with Donald Trump, with Bill de Blasio, I was making decisions, I was living through scandal, and I know what happened. And what the press was telling the public was not the truth. So this was my effort to tell the public, and I did this, for the people of New York, for my administration, who I felt was so unfairly treated, for my family and for myself, because the truth still matters.
So you said 24 hours after resignation, after your resignation, or 72 hours later, the governor's resignation?
After we were out of office.
So after the governor's.
I resigned, and then 48 hours later, the governor resigned. And I aligned my resignation date with him. So I was actually there to turn out the lights on the last day with him. And it was 24 hours after that I decided I was going to write the book.
So as a human being, I have to ask you, what was it like to turn out the lights?
It's funny because people ask me what those last few days were like. And if I hadn't lived it, I'm not sure I would believe it. I mean, the hysteria and the lies that came out of that report and the way that the press and the extremist politicians treated the governor who gave himself to this state for 11 years, our staff, these hardworking public servants, it was just so disgusting. And because Andrew Cuomo is who he is, I mean, up until the last day, there was an incoming storm, and we were at 633 3rd Avenue doing storm prep and managing an incoming storm. And we were literally working until the clock struck 12 that night. And to me, it was about his commitment to the state and the people of New York, my commitment to the state and the people of New York, our entire team, that despite what the press was doing to us, to our families, after all of this time we'd given to public service, that no one was going anywhere until the job was done.
So you used the word hysteria. When you're using the word hysteria, you're talking about people outside the administration. But what was it like that last week or so inside the administration? I mean, you talked about the governor trying to stay on task with managing a storm. But what was it like for Melissa DeRosa, who was, you were the highest unelected government official in the state, correct?
Correct. And the first woman to hold the position. It was surreal. I'm not really sure there's another word for it. It was surreal.
Were you functioning?
I wasn't. Right after I resigned, and right after the governor resigned, I kind of shut down. I talk about it in the book. My family was incredibly worried about me. My mental health was deteriorating.
Were you sleeping?
I hadn't slept in literally 2 years. I hadn't slept since COVID started. You know, since the phone call I received on March 1st, 2020 from Dr. Zucker telling us we had our first confirmed case of COVID until the day after we left the
So
office.
that's the ground zero date.
That's
is
ground
March
zero
1st,
date.
2020.
March 1st, 2020.
So pardon me for being a lawyer and
Yeah, please.
parsing words, but when you say you didn't sleep, as someone who is a New Yorker and lived through this as a constituent, what do you mean when you say obviously you slept in 2 years? So what do you mean by that?
I mean, not really. When I say I didn't sleep, I mean I was working until 11 o'clock midnight every day and getting up at, between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m. every morning. And it wasn't because I was setting an alarm. It's because you couldn't sleep.
Were there things to do?
I mean, when I think back, and I write about this extensively in the book, but those early months of COVID, those early days, weeks, months of COVID, when we had people forget. And it's almost like because of the trauma we all experienced, it's like a trauma response. We've all like sort of blocked out and distanced ourselves from what those days were. But those early days, we were erecting field hospitals. We were building drive-through testing sites because people couldn't get out of their cars because we didn't know how COVID was being passed from one to the next. Remember, we didn't know if it was on surfaces. We didn't know if it was an airborne disease. We didn't know how long it stayed in the air. We didn't know how long you had to breathe it in, how close you could be to another person. This is before we understood masks. It was that whole period of time, and every day, closed down the St. Patrick's Day parade. Huge backlash from the Irish Catholic community. Andrew Cuomo had to step in and do that because Bill de Blasio didn't want to upset Cardinal Dolan. I mean, and then you think about it and you're like, but then there were people saying, why didn't you close down the entire economy instantly? Why did you close down the economy at all? But during those early days, there was such little information and the tasks were so great and the consequences of the decisions we were making, literal life and death. There was no time for sleep. There just wasn't. It was every ventilator you track down, every piece of PPE we're able to get to the state of New York, every decision we make, every hospital we build could be the difference between whether or not another grave is being dug. And there's no more weighty, experience than that. And so no, there was no time to sleep and there was very little sleep. And it wasn't just me. I mean, it was our entire staff.
You talk about it in the book, and you just mentioned the names Jared Kushner, Donald Trump, Bill de Blasio. Could we just break that down a little bit? Let's start at the top. Let's start with the White House.
Yep.
And what was Melissa's interactions with the White House in March of 2020?
So, the Governor Cuomo and Donald Trump have known each other 100 years, right? They both grew up
From New York.
Yeah, from New York.
Queens,
exactly.
right.
Queens, their fathers knew each
right,
other. Yeah, they lived not that far from each other when they were growing up.
Not exactly on the same side of things, maybe.
Maybe not
philosophically,
on the same side of
right.
things philosophically, but they've known each other a million years, and so they would speak directly to one another. And then Jared Kushner and I were sort of the points of contact between New York and the White House. So if the conversations weren't being had by the president and the governor, it was Jared and I.
And how was it dealing with him?
It depended on the day. And I have to say, and I give him credit in the book, Jared has gotten a really bad rap and some of it's deserved. Some of it I think is undeserved. He, I viewed as sort of the most rational person in a mosh pit of, lunatics, honestly.
Yeah, I actually just read his biography.
Yeah.
Or I think it's his autobiography. And of course, in an autobiography, you're going to make yourself seem like the most rational person. But that is actually how he came on. I mean, he balanced not throwing the president under the bus too much, but he made it clear that there were times where
they disagreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he was, when I would reach out to him early and we were trying to chase down ventilators, we were trying to get PPE. I mean, it was clear to me that when, the president would give him the green light, he was doing everything he could to be helpful.
So
and then up until a point.
You just said about the president giving the green light.
Yeah.
Was there any feeling that Melissa DeRosa got that President Trump, who, although he's a New Yorker as president, didn't seem to be the biggest friend of New York in some of his decisions, did you get any sense that that President Trump Did Melissa DeRosa get any sense that maybe Jared Kushner was not being given the green light by President Trump?
You know, we had such a terrible history with Trump going into COVID, and people sort of forget this. They repealed SALT, state and local tax deductibility.
That's exactly what I was referring to as a constituent.
Right, which, they did, we believed, to punish New York, which in essence raised our property taxes here. Just before COVID hit, we had enacted the ability for non-documented people to get driver's licenses. When that happened, they enacted a rule at the federal level removing the state of New York from the Trusted Traveler Program, which expedites screening in federal airports. And we were one of 12 states in the country that had this law in the books, but yet we were the only one singled out. And so, Trump had this chip on his shoulder vis-a-vis New York. I think that he resented the people of New York because it was his home state, but we so, hugely rejected him electorally. And during COVID, there was this new element that was introduced into everything, where Andrew Cuomo was overnight, this world hero. And he was being compared to, people were saying he was the de facto commander in chief. He was the Winston Churchill of our time. These press conferences we were giving every day were must-see TV internationally. Our ratings were higher than the president. Not that we cared, but he cared. And he became obsessed with this idea that the Democratic Party was going to remove Joe Biden from the ballot and replace him with Andrew Cuomo. And so,
was that ever
no,
in the realm
it's like
of possibilities?
fantasy land. I mean, it was never a conversation.
But you do write in the book about Andrew possibly being the Attorney General of the United States of America under a Biden administration.
Well, that came much later.
Okay.
That was after Biden was elected. He talked
After he was elected?
After Biden was elected,
But before he was sworn in?
Yeah, I think it was in the end of November, early December of 2020. Okay. So it was when he was, President-elect Bidden. That notion was being kicked around.
So let's go back to Trump being a little afraid of Andrew Cuomo.
So everything that he did through that lens. So he would overreact to like the teeniest bit of criticism and go crazy. At one point, and by the way, it wasn't just, his focus was Andrew Cuomo, but the entire time we were going through COVID, his eye was on November. He was waiting for the presidential election to come. And so every decision he was making was hyper political. And I recount in the book this conversation I have with Jared in April of 2020. We had just started to, bend the curve in New York. We finally were on good footing.
I haven't heard that since I read it in the book, right?
Bend the curve. That's what
it.
We did.
Flatten it. Got to flatten the curve.
And Trump was out, I'm sure your listeners remember, liberate Michigan, liberate, Ohio. He was on Twitter saying these things, time for the governors to reopen their economies, because he was concerned that if we didn't get the economies up and running, it was going to be detrimental to his reelection effort. And I picked up the phone and called Jared one day, and I said, could you talk to the president about tamping it down a little bit? Because we just got this under control in New York. We were the global epicenter, thousands of people dying every day. We finally have this in a good place. We don't need, I didn't say this directly, but we don't need the president upending all of that progress. And he said to me on the phone, our interests no longer align. We're looking at polling in swing states, and people have had it with the economy being closed.
In the book, you're quite upset about that.
Yes.
In the book, you're about with Jared and
with Jared.
Right.
But but this was the way. It was throughout the entirety of the pandemic. I tell another story in the book later on where they are threatening to send National Guard into New York, and the next day, I stave it off with this call with Jared, and then the next day the governor and the president, come to an agreement where if the governor stops criticizing Trump's COVID response, then he won't send federal troops into New York. So these were the kinds of political landmines we were, bobbing and weaving through, but then layer in a once-in-a-century pandemic that's killing tens of thousands of people and so much unknown. And so it wasn't just the global health crisis we were dealing with and the fact that there were all these life and death decisions. There was a layer of politics embedded in our day-to-day life with Donald Trump in the White House that just complicated everything to a degree that I can't even articulate.
You talked about landmines, right? And let's talk about what Donald Trump then seized upon, and many of the Cuomo administration critics seized upon, and that had to do with the nursing homes. I actually have a clip that I want to play regarding that because I want to give you the opportunity to respond. I know that was a decision that was made without the hindsight, right? The 2020 hindsight that we have now. Let's just listen to that clip.
The outrage is growing after this report from the New York Post. It claims that the Cuomo administration may have admitted to hiding nursing home data from federal authorities.
It's a leaked phone call involving Governor Andrew Cuomo's top aide and Senate Democrats that has Cuomo at the center of the biggest scandal of his 10-year tenure as governor. The scathing phone call, first reported by the New York Post, includes quotes from Secretary to the Governor Melissa DeRosa, seemingly admitting the state hid nursing home death data from the Trump administration to avoid it being used against the Cuomo administration in a Department of Justice investigation.
Andrew Cuomo and his team, they went on their daily briefings and they lied to the public. They lied to you and the press. They lied to the state legislature. And they likely lied to the Department of Justice.
Okay, so Melissa, before you're going to respond to that, did that cause friction between you and the governor? Because they're basically like saying you confessed and you weren't being transparent, and obviously that was not a good look for the governor, and I know you have an appropriate response, but what about the personal nature between you and him?
No, not for a second. He knew, I mean, the New York Post, which I can get into in a second, but he knew that what was being reported was not truthful. And the only thing he was worried about in that moment was my well-being and making sure that I was okay, because for the first time in my life, I was at the center of a firestorm in the press.
So were you okay?
Was I okay? No, I was not okay.
So how did you react? Like physically, how did you react?
I shut down. And I write about that in the book. After that happened, the next day, we were flying down to the White House to meet with Biden. I had served on Biden's transition committee. I had worked for Obama and Biden a decade earlier. You know, I have a lot of friends that were working in the White House at the time. And we were excited. We were going to go down and catch up with old friends and talk about the future and how we were going to all come together to make things stronger in New York. We had a real partner in the White House for the first time in 4 years. And I talk about in the book, we're in the car on the way there, and I turned to the governor and I was like, I can't come with you. I can't. I'm so humiliated. I'm so horrified.
What was his reaction?
And he said, it's going to be okay. And he's like, come with me. It's going to be okay. And I was like, I can't. And he got on the plane alone, and I went back to the Capitol. And it was
what did you do when you went back to the Capitol?
It was sort of my first, step down this really dark retreat into I just was a shell of a person. No, I went back to my desk and I did my best I could to work, but I was a shell of a person from that point, for a little while. I was just not me.
Okay, but let's talk a little bit about the substance, because again, as a lawyer,
please,
I broke down what you said, or what they're claiming you said, juxtaposed to what was really happening at the time. So I apologize, but my role is to advocate, so I want to answer for you, but because I can, but you can provide the answer.
The New York Post lied. The New York Post got a leaked transcript of a conversation, and the reporter Bernadette Hogan lied. She put out into the press that I admitted to saying that we hid nursing home deaths to be able to evade the feds from investigating us, which was a lie. And what was incredible was, 3 days later, the full transcript comes out for all the press to see. And Politico, as I write in the book, actually reviews it independently and says, there's nothing in here to further that Melissa DeRosa said they were hiding deaths from the federal officials. In fact, it's the opposite. She says, we cooperated fully. We gave them everything that they asked for. And so it was a lie. And what I didn't appreciate in the moment was that the New York Post putting that out there created this firestorm. And the rest of the reporters didn't have the transcript. So all they could do was go off of, a historically sensationalized tabloid. And they all just repeated the same thing.
But then what happens when they do get the transcript?
So then nothing. And that was the worst part. Politico writes this story saying, actually, that's not what she said at all. And as I also write in the book, that was in February of 2021. In July of 2021, we get a letter from the feds, from Department of Justice, saying, we reviewed the numbers you submitted. They all look correct. And there's nothing here that warrants an investigation. But that was 7 months too late for me. Or 5 months, I guess it was. At that point, the die had been cast. The narrative had been built. And it was a tsunami. There was no way to undo the damage.
So what I say is when my clients get arrested, they're on the cover of the paper, and when they're fully acquitted, it's on page 38 between
That's
the
right.
obituaries and the P.C. Richards ads, and that's exactly what happened here. You said you weren't functioning, but then you went back to your desk, right? You shut down, but you went back to your desk. So obviously you're being a little hard on yourself. You were functioning. Like in the book, I kind of thought you were literally going to go home and hide under the covers.
Well, I did that at points too, but
Yeah.
it was, look, I was like a machine back then. I would get up still at the same time, 4:35 a.m. at that point, because it was a year later. And I would get up and go to the office, and I was at my desk every day. I was there until late at night. I just wasn't the same person. I was much more vacant. My mental health was breaking down. I was the target of this giddy press tsunami, which first started with nursing homes and then morphed into the sexual harassment allegations. And it was unlike anything I ever wish on anyone.
So at that time, pardon me for not having the exact calendar in front of me, and you write about this in the book, the governor decides he's going to write a book. Mm-hmm. And your father, who I'm looking forward to speaking to you about in a moment, because I've got to know him a little bit, I think he calls you or tells you, like, no, don't do that. This is not the time to write a book. Tell the listeners, what was your position on the governor writing the book?
The governor, at the end of June of 2020, after we finished our final press conferences, so our last daily press conference was June 19th, he called me on the phone with his daughters in the car and said, what do you think? We're talking about it. Should I do a book? It would be about the first half of the pandemic so people can learn the lessons going into the second half of the pandemic. We had the first wave. The country's now just getting into the first wave. So I was going to the second wave. And I, as you mentioned, I talked to my dad about it, and he's like, "This is a spectacularly bad idea. It's going to have people on, the far left and the far right coming at him. They're going to say this is arrogance. They're going to say this is premature." And looking back, I think I knew that, and it was one of those moments as a staffer where if I could get in a time machine, I wish I would have spoken up and been much more forceful in that moment. Because, so much of the damage that was done as a result of, this perception that he was too arrogant and taking a victory lap, and it did provide our political opponents with, with weapons to come after him, and the pandemic wasn't over. And it was one of those things where it was like, if he had waited a year, it would have taken out this bullet that was in the chamber for everyone to use against him. And and like, for what at the end? I wish if I could got in a time machine, I would have said, don't do it.
Regarding the nursing homes.
Yeah.
Somebody who I know who lost both of her in-laws was Janice Dean. She was a woman on Fox News, and, she's been attacking the governor from day one till now. Again, now you have the luxury of so much more information, so much more knowledge, the hindsight. How should the nursing home situation have been handled? Did you handle it the right way? Did you do the best you could under the circumstances? But knowing the scientific facts now, if you could redo it, if you could go into that time machine, what would you have done differently?
I write about this in the book. I didn't make the decision on nursing homes. It was a decision that was made by the Department of Health in consultation with people on the COVID task force. And these were wartime decisions made in a moment in an effort to stop the hospital system from collapsing. And the thing that gets so lost, because it got so emotional for good reason, because it's a painful topic, but then it was layered into politics and it was weaponized, is that every state in the country that has looked at this, every study comes back with the same conclusion, which is that COVID was brought into the nursing homes by staff and by visitors before anyone knew COVID was here. We now know COVID was here as early as January of 2020. We didn't shut things down until March 20th of 2020. That was 2 months and 20 days where it was running rampant through this city and this state. And so when you actually look at the statistical analysis and you see the rate at which staff people were getting it and the rate at which people were getting it in the nursing homes. That was the direct correlation. It didn't have anything to do with the admissions policy. And the Assembly's impeachment report backed that up. And again, independent studies done around the country have shown it was staff that was brought in. So I actually think that the nursing home issue, again, was so weaponized and so politicized. And this was something, that Trump and was driven a lot by the tabloids. In August of 2020, the president was furious that the governor had given a convention speech where he had criticized him. And it was and Jared Kushner and I write this in the book, Jared calls me the next day, furious. The president was furious. He called off 4 major infrastructure projects they had promised to do with us as retaliation, retribution for the governor's convention speech. And a couple of days later, they order this investigation into New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Michigan, 4 Democratic states. The nursing home admission policy was almost identical across 11 states, including Republican states. So if it was really about the policy, why were they not looking at all 11 states?
So it's interesting, Melissa, because there's a couple things you're very consistent in the book on. And one of them is you feel very strongly that your administration was very focused on policy and not politics. But you're critical of many around you who didn't agree with a lot of your decisions, that those decisions were made on politics, not on policy. Do you feel that way right this moment?
Well, but meaning what? Like, our COVID decisions were purely based on policy with the best information we had in the moment with the best possible intentions. Juxtapose that with the President of the United States' chief advisor, Jared Kushner, on the phone with me saying, the president's going to yell and scream about reopening the economy because we're looking at polling numbers in swing states.
Yeah,
and
not
that's
happy
what
about
people
that in
want.
the book.
And, the governor delivers a speech at a Democratic National Convention, which is by definition a political speech, where he has 4 sentences that mention Trump. And the next day, Jared Kushner calls me and says, that's it. Gateway Tunnel, 2nd Avenue Subway, LaGuardia Air Train, dead. We're not negotiating with you anymore. And 3 days later, they used the Department of Justice to investigate us. I mean, I don't really, when we talk about it, and this is one of the things that I think it was so important to write the book and for the public to really understand, because these were things that were not in the press in real time. The level of politics, we were dealing with a weaponized Justice Department, which obviously we weren't the only ones. I mean, we now have seen many people we now know the Trump Justice Department. It's not, I think, a coincidence that Jeff Clark, who was going after us on the nursing home investigation, is now under criminal indictment because he was who Trump was using to try to overturn the election results. So, I mean, we were doing the best we could with the information we had in real time, and at every turn, these things were being weaponized against us.
When did there come a time where you took a deep breath and said, okay, this COVID thing is under control? And how much time did you have between that and when the sexual allegations popped up?
Well, there's the only time during that period where I felt like I took a deep breath and I felt like COVID was under control was the summer of 2020. We had driven positivity under 1%, and it stayed under 1% from July 1st, I think it was, until the middle of September. And our hospitalizations were down, and there was 1 to 2 to 3 people dying a day versus 800 people that were dying a day in the April prior. So it was actually during that brief hiatus over the summer in between the first and second wave. And then the second wave hits in September. The Jewish holidays happen, kids go back to school. All of a sudden there's a lot of gatherings. All of a sudden there's these COVID spikes. We're dealing with hot spots. We're closing things down again. And then we're trying to roll the vaccine out. And we're trying to roll the vaccine out in December, January.
Well, I just want to stop you because you write about in the book about closing things down, and you and the governor butt heads about that period of time.
Yeah.
November. Are you going to take claim for saying you wanted to limit the amount of people in the house for Thanksgiving, and
no, it was my
Governor
fault.
Cuomo pushed back and said, we can't do that. And
It was my fault. I write about this in the book when we started to see the numbers spike. And I reflect on this. I now can see it so clearly. He saw it in real time. When everyone leaves and I walk into him and I'm like, just shut it all down. We need to shut it all down again. We know where this is going. And he looked at me and was sort of like, hey, come on. It's okay.
I think you used the
we
term,
know
he said you were
more.
being too emotional.
Yeah,
or
he's
something.
like, you're being emotional. And he said, you're letting your emotion drive you. We know more now than we did in March. And what I can see now clearly is that in that moment, watching those numbers rise, I was triggered. And it was like an emotional response. My heart started to beat
triggered
faster.
is like PTSD
Exactly.
terms we
It was
use.
like a
Okay.
PTSD where all of a sudden my mind just went back to graves on Hart's Island. The only sounds you hear in the city are ambulance sounds piercing the silence. People having to be home again, and my heart beats faster, and you start to sweat, and it's like that you have an actual physical reaction to the emotional reaction.
What was your physical reaction?
It was that. It was
Just
like
everything you
literally,
just
like my heart.
Did you
started
gain
beating,
weight? You lose weight?
my weight, oh my god, during that period I was like I was like skin and bones. I lost, I think I write in the book, something like 12 pounds, and I'm a thin person to begin with. And it was, I write in the book, there was one moment where when I saw the numbers going up, it's like I was clenching I caught myself clenching my fist. It's sort of that flight or fright, mentality. Flight or fright, thank you.
So before we move on to the whole sexual accusations, you are very vulnerable in the book, and you talk about your personal life. You were married.
Yep.
During this period of time when we were all isolating, when the governor said, I'm getting tired of looking at my dog,
Yeah.
who were you with?
Well, at the beginning, I was staying with family. My family's in Albany, and so I would bounce around their houses and stay with them when I was up there until there was a scare that somebody in my office had COVID. And then I was afraid if, God forbid, I got COVID and brought it home to my family, I would never forgive myself. And back then, we had no idea, and people were dying, and my father's a diabetic, and we just didn't know. And so then I moved into a hotel temporarily by myself, isolating in this horrible hotel, the Renaissance in Albany, where there's neon purple lights in the room.
I know it. I know.
You go home at night, and I write in the book.
I'm not saying it's terrible. Listen to DeRosa saying that.
It's actually a lovely hotel, but
Yeah.
during those days,
No, it was-
there are these neon purple lights
Yeah,
in
I'm
the room.
aware of exactly what you
And
speak.
I write in the book at one point, that was rock bottom, was returning to that room after, 18-hour days to these neon purple lights, and I couldn't do my laundry, and I was afraid to let housekeeping in.
Were you in communication with your husband at the time? You guys were
We
apart.
weren't. I mean, it was very limited. As I write in the book, we had been separated January, February, March. And actually the opening scene of the book, which I always think back to, like, when did it all start? It was, for me, it was in January of 2020. We had dinner before we were going to be separated and not speak for 3 months. And we're sort of going through the ground rules of separation. And, he says, we can't speak. This is what we agreed to. And I said, well, what if it's an emergency? And he said, well, if it's an emergency, then we'll speak. And I said, well, what defines an emergency? And he's like, I don't know, but we'll know it when it comes. And then, bam, COVID hits. But no, so I was completely isolated and alone. And at one point, I ended up moving into the mansion. Me, Larry Schwartz, Stephanie Benton, the governor's cousin, Matt Cuomo, his kids. It turns into this hotel where the staff is staying, members of the staff are staying, his family is staying. And, all of a sudden I could do laundry and we could get food, and it's right around the corner from the Capitol. And so it was just this bizarre, I look back on that period of time, it was like up was down and down was up, and it was like,
I'm sure it was a lot better being with people than
it
being
was
in the purple
it was
hotel.
definitely better being, I say in the book, Stephanie Benton, who was the governor's right hand for 15
Ever.
years. Yeah.
So she looks like she's 25.
She
for the
looks like
record.
she's 25.
I was very surprised when I
Yes.
met, and she sounds that way on the phone as well.
But she, she and I became inseparable. She's one of my best friends in the whole world. And during that period of time, it was like we would come home, we would go back to the mansion and go to the pool house at the mansion. And, the governor and his family would be inside, and we would retreat out there and like have a glass of wine and unwind for 25 minutes,
What
at
kind of
11
wine?
o'clock
What kind of
at
wine
night.
were you going with?
I was a Sauvignon Blanc girl. She was a Chardonnay girl. But,
Okay, good
but
to
yeah,
know.
so that was
So
the
that sounds
screwed
like a
up
little
routine.
a glass half full. So let's talk about some more not too nice stuff. Jodi Kantor, New York Times. She's on one of the morning shows. And I have a clip here I want you to play, and then I want to hear what you have to say about it.
Governor Cuomo appeared to be a champion of the Me Too movement and an ally of victims, and now he's allegedly creating victims in his wake. How do people reconcile that?
I think that's one of the hardest to fathom things about this situation, because we've all heard a lot of these Me Too allegations over the years, but what is so distinct about these is that as this was exploding, as there was a global reckoning, the governor of New York was allegedly committing the same offenses. And there was a day 2 years ago, almost to the day, in August 2019, where on one day, the governor signed really important legislation protecting women. We're talking about landmark sexual harassment protections that women had sought for years. The next day, he allegedly continued his pursuit of that state trooper.
Does that make you, do you want to, your head want to blow up right now when you hear that?
Well, look, Jodi Kantor, the New York Times, in my view, has been discredited on sexual harassment, full stop. Let me just say that much. I mean, as I detail in the book, I had my own situation with the New York Times reporter that Carolyn Ryan, the people at the highest levels of the New York Times were aware of, and not only did they not blow the whistle, they let him take the lead on being the Me Too reporter. So let me just say that vis-a-vis the New York Times, they have no credibility on this topic as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, what I will say about the Me Too movement in general and about what happened with the governor and what happened during this moment of media, you know, sort of created scandal is that nobody actually stopped and said, what are these allegations? What are we even talking about? And that's part of why I really hope New Yorkers and people in general pick up the book, because I go through them in painstaking detail. 1, 2, 3,
You really,
4.
you really do. Like, if people really want to know, I mean, the book is great, and we're going to talk about how vulnerable you are in the book, about yourself, but you really do break it down in a lawyerly fashion, if I may say so myself. And to be blunt, you kind of call BS on each and every one of them.
Well, and here's the thing. I'm not saying that 11 women are lying, not by a long shot. But here's what I think people don't realize. 9 of the 11 allegations or these things are things that took place in the company of other people. Like, we're talking about a kiss on a cheek at the wedding.
In front of her father.
Yeah. We're talking about a hand on a waist for a photograph. We're talking about saying to someone, you look lovely today. We're talking about, you know, saying something in Italian that the woman says, I don't know what he said, I don't understand Italian, but I think he was talking about my looks. You know, we're talking about these things where it became, and let's speak about the New York Times, puts on the front page, the New York Times, which by the way broke the Harvey Weinstein scandal, which is a serious thing, rape, you know, holding jobs and careers over women, whether or not you're going to sleep with Harvey Weinstein. And now, fast forward to 2021, you've got Andrew Cuomo on the front page of the New York Times with his hands on a woman's face at a wedding, literally a wedding attended by reporters.
So why, Melissa DeRosa? What made the New York Times
feeding frenzy?
Why?
It's a good question, and I would love.
I mean, he was a hero not that long before that during COVID, and now we're talking about months later, and now, so why is he all of a sudden? Is it because during the course of your administration, you talk about Machiavellian, you say, well, I mean, the bottom line is, did Andrew Cuomo bully his way into his problems?
I don't accept that. And I've heard people sort of posit that before. The New York Times, when they put that wedding woman on the front page, they were sending a message to every other media organization in the country that this is a front page offense. And suddenly, any trivial interaction is just given a number and thrown into a pile and given a number. 6th offense, 7th complaint, 8th complaint, 9th complaint.
Right. It didn't matter how minimal they were. It didn't matter that one of them, sorry for taking your thunder, one of them said, I didn't feel intimidated. I didn't feel like it was
not one,
3. Right, I apologize. 3.
3 of the women said
so
under
Melissa
oath,
DeRosa,
I wasn't sexually harassed.
But let me rewind. Why? In other words, Andrew, I can answer why they would do that to Donald Trump. I can answer why they could do that to several other people. Even a Democrat like Bill de Blasio, I can see them doing it. But why Andrew Cuomo? The man, you guys just won an Emmy Award. Heroic Attorney General of the state of the United States of America, possibly. He was in the Clinton administration. So why all of a sudden the New York Times decide we're going to take out Andrew Cuomo?
I mean, that's an answer for the New York Times. But when I look back on that period, it was like hysteria and politics meeting the Me Too movement in this moment. And we were just off the rails. And as you said, Arthur, and I go through this in the book, I mean, there's 11 women in the report. 3 of the women said under oath, I wasn't sexually harassed. I mean, I think the public would think very differently if they knew one of the allegations was a doctor on national television, which the entire country watched the press conference. She's dressed like a beekeeper in head-to-toe PPE with a face mask and a face shield doing the governor's COVID test, and he quips, "You make that gown look good." That's one of the 11.
I'm aware.
You know, but people aren't, right? And the reporters didn't do their job. None of the reporters, when that report came out, didn't say, whoa, why is the doctor in this report? Why are 3 women who say under oath they weren't sexually harassed in the report? Why are you including people who don't even work for the state when this is supposed to be a sexual harassment report? And then subsequently, the one serious allegation, I will say like serious because it involves touching, which was the forcible touching of Brittany Camiso up in Albany. That claim falls apart once the sheriff brings the case and once the DA actually looks at the underlying evidence, and he has to dismiss it because there's no way that it would have
But Melissa
flown.
DeRosa, as he dismisses it, he says, "We believe her."
He didn't say we believe her.
What? Okay, correct me.
He
What did he say?
said-
We find her credible.
No, no. He said, Dan Abrams did a piece on this. I would love to find the exact quote, but Dan Abrams did the piece where Dan Abrams actually dissects his language. They said, we cannot meet our burden at trial. And they said, we take credible claims like this seriously. And so Dan Abrams actually broke down the language and was like this, where it's not necessarily they're saying this was credible, they're saying credible claims like this, seriously. But look, it was politics. Mimi Roca in Westchester. I mean, the district attorney in Westchester. I am investigating this matter in Westchester. Does
Nassau
everyone
County.
know
There were
what
5
they were
different
talking about?
five
but,
counties.
But the people never realized Mimi Roca, who's supposed to be a serious human being, you know what she was investigating? A kiss on the cheek after the governor said to this woman, "May I give you a kiss on the cheek?" That's being criminally investigated.
Okay, so I'm still trying to dig why. Is it because we just heard Jody Cantor say that you guys had this landmark legislation regarding
I don't think
women's
it was
rights?
that. I mean, look, even Al Franken, it's like, look what they did to him. I mean,
Yeah, but that was what they did to him was ridiculous because he was a comedian doing comedic things, and that's what he's being, that's what he was being punished for. But look, I have no problem telling you in my profession, I was not happy with the legislation, some of the legislation you guys passed about.
No, trust me, I hear it all the time.
How easy it became to use your legislation as a sword, not as a shield, not to protect women, not to help women, but to use it for them to hurt others. And I think I know people who I know have said to me, well, Cuomo, by passing those things, he put himself in a different category. Standards were different. All of a sudden, he's supposed to be like a monk, or and really not have any. And here's a single man in his 60s. He's not supposed to flirt at all. He's not supposed to say anything inappropriate to a woman in a beekeeper suit because he championed himself as the guy who is here to protect women. And that's what Jody Cantor said on the morning show. So, what's that term? Falling on your own petard?
I don't know if it was that. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, but I think that it reached a level of insanity, the likes of which, no one had ever seen. And again, to this day, and the reaction I get to my book when people actually read it and they say, "What? That's what this was?" And even people who haven't read my book, I think 2 years removed from everything's calmed down. People look back with a more sober assessment. And I hear constantly from people saying, why did he resign? Why? Nothing ever came of those things. Why did he have to go?
I know you know why he resigned, so why don't you tell people why he resigned? Because you said you guys are as good at counting votes as anyone else. So tell people, why did he resign?
No, the legislature, there's no due process written into the state constitution in New York State. There is no high crimes and misdemeanors like there is federally. And the assembly had announced publicly that they were intending to impeach. in New York, as soon as you're impeached, you're automatically removed from office. And the Senate had the votes to find him guilty at trial. And for the intellectually dishonest members of the media who to this day say he should have just fought through impeachment if he really believed that he didn't have a problem, really? I point you to Justice LaSalle, who, when he went up for his vote,
Yes.
as I'm sure your listeners are well aware,
We covered that extensively.
he didn't have due process. His record was completely distorted.
Totally distorted.
This man who served honorably for decades, dragged through the mud. It was over before he even stepped into the Capitol. And that's what it would have been for the governor. And the governor knew it.
Okay, but I'm going to ask you the same question about the New York Times. Why did Andrea Stewart Cousins and why did Speaker Carl Hastie want Governor Hochul as opposed to Andrew Cuomo? Well, they knew who they were getting, right?
I don't think it was that simple. Look, especially for Carl, I think that Carl was under so much pressure. Biden goes out. Biden says, I didn't read the report, but he should resign.
Believe me.
And he said, I didn't read the report, but
like
he should resign.
A lot of people in Congress said, well, I didn't read Obamacare, but I voted for it. I'll read it later.
Yeah.
So-
And once he did that, and the President of the United States says something like that, it creates this momentum that becomes impossible to withstand. And there were extremist members in the legislature who had wanted Andrew Cuomo out before any of this, having nothing to do with nursing homes, having nothing to do with saying sweetheart or kissing someone on the cheek or putting your hand on someone's waist for a photograph. They wanted him out because they hated him politically. And they
But why did they hate him politically?
Well, because pick a reason. The far right feared him. Trump was concerned. I told you in all of 2020.
I get the far right part, but the assembly and the speaker, the assembly and the Senate.
Saying, it's not that simple. Carl, I think, was just swept up in the moment. He couldn't withstand the pressure because it all of a sudden became the stampede because once Biden said it, allegations against women, especially as it relates to the Democratic Party, impossible to withstand. So you have this stampede. But there was this far fringe, Alessandra Biaggi, AOC.
Your friend. If anybody wants to have a good, it's almost like watching a boxing match. Look, you brought it up. You talk in the book about, you wrote her some tweets or texts that I don't think wasn't the sweetest language. Let's leave it at that. Let me ask you a question. If she walked in the room right now and we all left, and it was just the two of you and Alexandra Biaggi, what would you have to say to her?
Alessandra Biaggi. I have nothing to say to Alessandra Biaggi. I wish her well in divinity school, which is where she currently is after she, got crushed in her congressional primary against Sean Patrick Maloney when, for all of her talk about toxic work environment, it turns out she was a bully and she created a toxic and hostile work environment for her employees. So I have nothing to say to Alessandra Biaggi that's not in the book, and I wish her well in divinity school.
What's crazy is I'm positive her grandfather and Mario Cuomo had to go way back. I mean, her grandfather was a congressman during the period of time.
Oh my God, he ran the machine. They were machine politicians. I mean, her grandfather, famously worked with the mafia to try to stop The Godfather from being filmed in New York. So, I mean, yeah, he was around a long time. He obviously, his career did not end the way that their family would have wanted. She was very sensitive about that.
When she was all against Columbus, all I was saying is her grandfather's rolling over his grave. He was such a proud Italian American. Mario Biaggi, a storied individual. So, Melissa, you're a young, brilliant woman with incredible, your history of what you've seen at such a young age is tremendous. You're clearly a leader in this community. What's next in the Me Too Time's Up? How we strike this balance between obviously protecting women and making sure nobody gets harassed or treated inappropriately, and what happened to Governor Cuomo, which I hope you realize now happens all the time. All the time. I mean, this is my job, right? I'm defending these people a majority of the time.
No, look, I would say Me Too was a necessary corrective in this country for a lot of reasons. As I said, it started with Harvey Weinstein, right? And that was talk about a monster. And the women who he traumatized.
Listen, I got to slow down. You realize I represented him at trial. Right?
Oh, I did not know that.
I was his trial attorney.
Okay, well, okay.
I'm actually arguing his appeal.
Okay. So we'll skip past him.
Yeah. No. You can't listen. You can't skip past him. And if we're really being honest now, it technically didn't really start with Harvey Weinstein. It started with the most powerful man in media. Who was the most powerful man in media?
Who was it?
Roger Ailes.
Roger Ailes, you're right. It did start with Roger
And now
Ailes.
Roger wasn't accused of touching anyone. He was accused of saying, you and I should have had sex a long time ago. It would have been better for you. It would have been better for me. And then shortly thereafter, that person didn't get the ratings. It was proven she didn't get the ratings. But during the period of time, there were all kinds of emails showing he was trying to promote her. He was trying to elevate her ratings. And then his team was like, look, she's just not rating. We got to get rid of her. And then she handed over this tape. And he was gone. He was making $1 billion a year, and he was gone. And that was the first domino to fall. And then Kevin Spacey and Harvey and,
So I always associate Me Too starting with the Harvey Weinstein.
I know, but having lived it, I started the genesis.
But I do think the Me Too movement, at which I was at the helm very early on, and, in terms of changing policy and giving speeches and being at the table, extending the statute of limitations on rape, etc. I do believe the Me Too movement was an incredibly necessary corrective in this country in a lot of ways. And I think that its power was trying to equalize the power dynamic in the office, where women could set their own boundaries and they could speak up and speak out and be protected. Where I think we lost our way, and I've said this before, is that some things require an apology. You kissed me on the cheek, I don't want to be kissed on the cheek. Apologize. Some things require training. Maybe you're out of step with modern day. Maybe there's, things in the office that people don't feel are appropriate. So it requires training and should be taken seriously. Some require firing and some require jail. But the problem is that the Me Too movement at some point lost its way, and it became sort of this proxy for, if I feel uncomfortable or I don't like something, then it's tantamount to you should be fired and ended and canceled.
And sued, and I want $1 million.
And monetized, and yes, and the problem is that I believe that you're already seeing the pendulum swing back. And I think that what could ultimately end up happening, which is my greatest fear, is that you end up in a situation where serious claims aren't taken seriously because people roll their eyes when they think about Me Too, or they think it's gone too far, and then you're dismissive about really meaningful claims. And that's where I'm afraid we could end up. And so, my hope is that we start to have this conversation open and honestly, because I think it's happening a lot sort of just beneath the surface, and you're sort of seeing it play out in different ways that I think could end up being damaging for the women's movement.
Of all the claims against Governor Cuomo, what was the oldest one?
The oldest claim? Karen Hinton, I guess. Which was this woman who had worked for him, and she didn't work for him at the time, that she alleges he gave her a hug that was too tight. She was a consultant. And it was from, I think it was, 2000 or something.
So that's 20
years. The allegation was it was a hug that was too tight. And what's amazing, she was writing a book at the time that she made that claim. And 3 years earlier, when Me Too actually did start in earnest, in 2017, 2018, she wrote an article in the Daily News, an op-ed in the Daily News, where she, unprompted, unasked, on her own accord, says, I'm lucky that I have had male bosses like Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio, who, while being no-nonsense managers, know how to treat women respectfully. And so it came off a little bit disingenuous, where then while she's trying to promote a book and these other women are saying some things, that she kind of jumped on the bandwagon. And, I lay all that out in the book for people to decide for themselves.
So how does Andrew Cuomo, how does he defend himself from something that happened 20 years ago that he has no recollection of, no knowledge of, but you guys are the ones who extended the statute of limitations? And again, I'm speaking now as a criminal defense attorney.
Well, I don't think a hug from 20 years ago falls under the statute of limitations.
Okay, I'm using that kind of as an example. Look, anyone who reads this book will really see that there's no real, I got to be careful, but there's no sex. There's no sex. This is not Harvey Weinstein.
This is a sex scandal. No, there was. Look, as I said, 9 of the 11, instances, or
had no women, touching.
Were in front of other people. It was either at a public event or around other people. These were not closed door situations. Correct. And the 10th, there's 2 things that happened out of sight. One was this staffer who said that he had 2 personal inappropriate conversations with him. No touching. She doesn't even allege he ever kissed her on the cheek. And then this other woman, which was up in Albany, Brittany Camiso, whose case ultimately was dismissed in Albany. And so when you put that in perspective, I think people will see it differently, and I think people have started to see it differently. But in the hysteria of the moment, it didn't matter. A kiss on the cheek was as bad as rape, and you were to be executed, and you were to be canceled, and you were to resign. I mean, there's this moment where, the Andrew Stewart cousins come out and says, okay, there's been 2 claims. Lindsey Boylan made a claim. Charlotte Bennett made a claim. If there's one more, he has to go. One more claim, he has to go.
I remember
it was like an invitation.
I remember it well.
And then it was, boom, the Wall Street Journal, front page, this woman, Anna Liss, who worked for the governor from 2013 to 2015. So we're talking almost 10 years ago, whose allegations were, he put his hand on my waist for a photograph. He, called me sweetheart once, and he kissed me on the cheek once. And that was it. Resign.
I know. Melissa, what's very interesting for me, even at this moment, after having gone through the book, is that even though we didn't know each other, in a weird way, from what I do, you guys were kind of my adversary. I'm like, why are they making it easier to bring the really maybe the worst claims on the planet besides actually killing somebody? Why are they making this so much easier? And now that you see how these things can be abused, I sense from reading your book and hearing you speak, and even hearing the governor speak, I'm not going to say you have any regrets, but you probably are a little bit more aware of how people could misuse. I'm not saying you guys were coming from a bad place when you did what you did, but how there probably should be more safeguards along the way. Like, hypothetically, in the state of New York, you do not have to have corroborating evidence for a sex act, right? It's just 2 people in a room. But a law could say, if it's a sex act that happened 10 years or more, we're going to keep the statute of limitations open, but you have to have some form of corroboration. Not necessarily that someone was in the room, but you have a plane ticket.
Sex, generally, there's only 2 people there. But no, look, this is a very complicated topic. And our attempt to remove severe and pervasive from the law was to make it easier for people to bring legitimate sexual harassment claims without having to go 17 rounds in court over what the definition of severe and pervasive was. And I do think that we were doing the right thing in the moment to try to make it fair, even playing field for women. I also think that some people have sought to monetize the law and weaponize the law and are trying to get 7-figure settlements for a kiss on the cheek. And this sort of goes to what I was saying before, which is it concerns me because then it makes it so it's so easy to be dismissive and roll your eyes and say this is no longer about women being abused and this is no longer about legitimate harassment or abuse. It's become a business, or it's become about weaponizing something to take someone out politically or get someone fired because you don't like them, and retaliation in other ways. And so I do think that when we see these situations crop up, it's the responsibility of responsible lawmakers.
Or lawyers, by the way.
And lawyers.
We're allowed to tell a client, no, I'm not taking that
Yeah,
case.
to sort of come to the table and make adjustments where adjustments are right and necessary.
One last question. When you guys found out that this report was going to be drafted, and one of the drafters was June Kim, who, oh God, is your response, who was the assistant U.S. attorney under Preet Bharara, who was trying to take you guys down from the beginning. At that point, was it a fait accompli in your brain that this,
well, look, the governor
this report
certainly
was going to be...
The minute that June Kim was appointed, we had an outside advisor who immediately convened a call with us and said, pull the plug. Pull back the authority to do the investigation. It's over. If June Kim is involved in this, he tried to take Andrew Cuomo out for 6 years, literally. 2 different federal investigations, tried 17 different ways. Preet Bharara, who's his best friend, who was his boss in the Southern District, was out holding the most inappropriate press conferences, saying the most ridiculous things on the radio about 3 men in the room, and he was going to go after the 3 men in the room and stay tuned, and just such a wild abuse of that office from Preet and June. And the minute that Tish James picked June Kim, the governor was like, this is
That's
it.
over. So let's talk
over.
about the politics of it all. The person whose name is not really in the book much, who's a major player in the state of New York, is Senator Chuck Schumer.
Yeah.
So what is Melissa, you're talking about major events in this book, and maybe there's a passing reference to Chuck Schumer.
Yeah.
Talk to me, Melissa DeRosa, about Senator Schumer.
look, there's not much to say in my view about Chuck. He I think sort of weaponized, politicized Me Too. He called for the governor to resign very early on. It had nothing to do with Anna List getting a kiss on the cheek. You know, I see Chuck Schumer at plenty of parades and press conferences embracing constituents, and there was an entire New York Times story written about his matchmaking in his office and trying to set people up and talking about their personal lives and encouraging romance and all kinds of things. And so, you know, Chuck Schumer called for Andrew Cuomo to resign because Chuck Schumer didn't like Andrew Cuomo. It had nothing to do with principle. And you can sort of see that across the river, right, in New Jersey, how it's like everyone in the Senate is calling for Menendez to resign and Schumer's not going to do it. Why? Because it could potentially jeopardize his, you know, his power and, you know, and this is a good buddy. And, you know, look, as I say in the book, you can sort of draw a straight line for people's calls to resignation to their own personal and political motivations.
So you said that Chuck Schumer doesn't like Andrew Cuomo.
No, I mean, look, for years, and it's not a secret.
Come on, give me a little, because it's not in the book. So come on, give me a little exclusive here. Give me something.
Look, the two of them did not. Chuck.
Does this go back to Mario Cuomo's days?
Chuck did not like that Andrew Cuomo would hold his feet to the fire. You know, the governor cared about delivering for New York. He didn't tiptoe around people's personal politics. So when things like SALT were going on in Washington, you know, he would look directly in the camera and say, Chuck Schumer, where are you on SALT? And by the way, Chuck Schumer, where are you on SALT? You know, Biden, you had a moment there where you had both houses, and he hasn't been able to deliver much for the state in terms of being a majority leader. Migrant crisis is completely out of control.
He did get the Gateway project back in, right?
He did,
the one that was taken away from you guys by Jared Kushner, he got it back. And that's a big deal for people who don't know. If that tunnel ever went down,
the whole northeastern corridor would collapse.
Yeah, it would be a
disaster.
depression for the United States of America.
But you know, the migrant crisis is out of control. I don't see him stepping up in any meaningful way. He is the majority leader. So anyways, look, the two guys, they are alpha males in this town, and they didn't get along well. And when Chuck stepped up and said he should resign, you know, in the spring of 2021, it had nothing to do with anything other than personal petty politics.
We're talking about people who aren't getting along. Andrew Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, and you do write about this kind of a little bit in the book. I mean, they know each other a long time. Andrew gave de Blasio his first big job when he was the HUD secretary. To the best of my recollection, though, although, and you write about this in the book as well as you guys got along very well with the Bloomberg administration, before de Blasio was even sworn in, it seemed like Governor Cuomo was already ripping on him and ragging on him. You guys kind of stole pre-K away from him. And
no, that's not true. Look, de Blasio wanted pre-K, but really he wanted the tax. He wanted the tax on the rich. And the governor did not believe and does not believe in taxing people for the sake of taxing them as a part of a political slogan. He was very concerned about driving out high income earners in New York, which make up, 50% of our base of the money that we take in. It's like 5% of people yield 50% of our tax revenue. And so when de Blasio came forward and wanted to do universal pre-K, which, by the way, incredible laudable goal, and he wanted to do this millionaire's tax to pay for it, the governor stepped in and said, I'll do you one better. We'll do it, and the state will pay for it, and we're not going to have to raise taxes because we have the money for it. And then it got into this, protracted back and forth between de Blasio and Governor Cuomo over this tax, which we didn't need. And so it really became about politics for the mayor, because the mayor wanted to make the wealthy pay more because that's what his far left base wanted. And as I write in the book, it set the two up on this collision course where the governor was much more pragmatic and believed you had to, make progress to be progressive, and de Blasio wanted to champion pie in the sky, policies in order to sort of burnish his, progressive credentials, which ultimately led him to run for,
but
president.
you figured out a way to get along with Emma Wolf,
yes,
the chief of staff. That's in the book as well. The chief of staff to Mayor de Blasio.
Yes.
And I mean, it's interesting because if you look back, I'll just say in my lifetime, Mario Cuomo, the Democrat, and Ed Koch, the Democrat, as mayor and governor, they didn't get along too well. Mario Cuomo, the Democrat, and Rudy Giuliani, the Republican, got along great, right? Then through the years, and then even with you guys, the Democrats, got along great with Bloomberg. Now, in the book, you credit basically how great Bloomberg was, efficient. You write in here, and I had this conversation with the young lawyers, that even as the mayor, the billionaire mayor, Bloomberg was in at 8 o'clock and would stay there until the day was done. Is that an accurate representation?
Absolutely. I mean, I write in the book the phrase game recognized game, which is what I always think about with Bloomberg and us. It was like that team so competent. Bloomberg was such a phenomenal executive. He took the job so seriously. As I said, in at 8, last one to turn the lights out. The people they hired were the best and the brightest. And that sort of matched our drive and commitment and the effectiveness of our team. And so it was like everyone kind of stayed in their own lane. And then when de Blasio was there, the feelings were not mutual. But I will say, Emma Wolf, phenomenal public servant, was a good friend to me for a lot of years. And, as I said, we managed to get along even though the principals couldn't. And I think that was a really important relationship.
I don't want to get too deep into the weeds regarding the politics, but there was something called the Independent Democratic Conference that was in the legislature. And it was a bunch of senators who were Democrats, but they were caucusing with the Republicans. And as an outsider looking in, it seemed that Melissa DeRosa, as the secretary, and Governor Cuomo, it seemed like you guys had a lot of juice and a lot of power to get things done when the Independent Democratic Conference was in place. And let me ask you the question. When they left, and it was straight Democrats, did that take Melissa DeRosa's ability as a public servant to help the community away a little bit?
We actually only had 1 year where the Democrats had straight control, which was 2019, because then 2020 COVID hit and the legislature was irrelevant.
Well, but 2019 became bail reform, right?
2019, we did do bail reform. That's
and
true.
A lot of the wasn't a lot of the sexual harassment stuff?
Yeah, but that was, I felt like we were I was driving a lot of that, the women's rights stuff. That wasn't something that was, driven necessarily by the legislature. In fact, the Assembly, as I'm sure you know from dealing with the legislature, historically hates to change anything in codes, anything that's increasing penalties for anything they're traditionally
Let me ask you this
against.
question. If the Independent Democratic Conference had stayed in power, would bail reform have passed?
I don't know.
In the form that it did?
I don't know, because the truth of the matter is the Senate Democrats were willing to do dangerousness standard. The standard that we had wanted was dangerousness, which is what every other state in the country that has no cash bail has in place, which people still want today. And it was Carl Heastie that wouldn't do it, because he was convinced, rightly or wrongly, he was convinced that judges, if they could use the dangerousness standard, would end up just using race as a proxy for dangerousness, and that you would end up in a situation where African American and Hispanics would end up being detained because a judge would see them and based on the color of their skin say this person is dangerous. And so it really was a principled issue coming out of the Assembly. The Senate was much more willing to be tougher on bail reform, and I think even today would do that.
So Governor Cuomo made news this weekend by talking about the protests that have been going on lately, and he talked about the fact that the protesters who are even doing illegal activities, they're in and they're out, and there's no bail set on them. Should Governor Cuomo sign that bail reform, or should he hung in tight and said, no, until there's a dangerousness standard, I'm not changing anything?
But that's not true anymore. I mean, they've made so many changes to bail. I mean, there's so many more things in place now where if somebody's doing something, they could hold them. And the issue over the weekend with the protesters
there's not any misdemeanors that they can hold people on any longer. There used to be.
That's true.
But that's all gone.
That's
and
true,
typically
but repeat
at these
offenders there are, and misdemeanors aren't violent crimes. They're not, so I mean, the bail conversation is another conversation which I feel has gotten very emotional and has sort of been devoid now from the facts and the statistics. And you look around the country and there were crime spikes in places that didn't do bail reform, and in cities that didn't do bail reform. There was a lot of post-COVID upticks in crime in places very similar to New York that were, sort of structural issues, poverty, underemployment, other things. And so I think the bail conversation is more complicated.
No, you could write another book on that
write
one if
another
you'd
book
like.
on that.
So before we wrap, I want to talk to you a little bit about personal stuff. One of the ways that you and I are similarly situated is to some degree, and I say this pridefully, but maybe when I was younger I didn't. You cried about it. But our fathers have both helped us tremendously. Our families have both helped us tremendously. I mean, I have followed almost precisely in my father's footsteps, being a New York City trial attorney, as was he. And, you know, I can't tell you how many courtrooms I go into. Oh, you Louis' kid, you Louis' kid. And my grandfather was even well known. Are you Artie's kid, a grandkid, or whatever? So you become the first woman, a very, very young person who becomes the secretary to the governor. It's the highest position that non-elected in the state. And the New York Times, even though regretfully, you're right, they kind of apologize to you personally. They write, you know, that you're the daughter of a very powerful lobbyist.
Yep.
And that really, really, first you got upset, you got red-faced, you got angry. Now that, you know, you've accomplished everything that you've accomplished, that was day one, right? Now you're, does it bother you now that they associated you with your father, to your accomplishments?
You know, it's not about being associated with my dad. I'm so proud of who my father is. I'm so proud of where I came from. I mean, I won the lottery with my family. It was that I felt as though, you know, no matter what I did, no matter how many years I worked, no matter how many glass ceilings I punched through, no matter how many accomplishments I notched, I was always just seen as sort of daddy's little girl. And in the eyes of people in Albany, you know, there was one time, I didn't write in the book, I get into this argument on Twitter with a Republican senator, and he tweeted back at me and said, "Your father taught you better than that." And I said to him at the time, would you say that to Bill Mulrow or Larry Schwartz or Steve Cohen, you know, any of my predecessors who were men? Would you say to a man who's 60 years old, your father taught you better? And so, you know, to have it come from the New York Times in particular, in that headline, just felt like when they saw me, the singular thing they saw was that I was the daughter of an Albany lobbyist. Not,
You know, I mean, look, I see where you're coming from. I guess I'm a little swayed now because I had the pleasure of spending a bunch of time with your dad. And
he's a great guy.
No,
He's the best.
and I didn't know it was your dad. So I was chit-chatting with him and admiring his sartorial splendor. And then I got to hear all about your grandmother. Now, I don't want to get you upset, but you write in the book about your grandmother and the fact that you hadn't communicated with her for a little while there. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, no, I talk about during COVID, my grandfather was living with my dad, like so many other families in America. You know, you're worried about grandpa, nano, whoever, you bring them home to stay with you. And, you know, there was this moment where I was thinking back on my grandmother, and my grandmother, who's I was her namesake, and I inherited her cheekbones and, you know, her work ethic, and I was her favorite after my father. You know, she was very old school Italian, and I had broken off an engagement when I was 28 years old, and she was so disappointed and so crushed by it. And every time I spoke to her after it happened, I could never figure out the right way to explain the why. And that generation didn't do frivolous things like that, right? They didn't, if they said yes to something, to spending the rest of their life with someone, they meant it. And so every time I spoke to her, I just heard the disappointment in her voice. And as I write in the book, at one point I stopped returning her phone calls. And then tragically, 2 months later, she gets hit by a car and she dies. And I never get the opportunity to talk to her again. And, you know, it was one of those things I thought about during COVID, which I think so many of us, you know, struggled with during that time that was so uncertain, which is thinking about what really matters. And thinking at the end of the day about the people who really matter. And as terrible as COVID was, I think it made us all sort of stop and take stock. And that was one of the things coming out of all of this that I told myself, you know, prioritize the people you love. Spend the time you have on this earth with the people who make it worthwhile. Don't let the moments go by. And I hope that that's one of the lessons people take from reading the book.
You portray yourself as a pretty tough cookie in this book.
Yeah.
You're not a shrinking violet. You actually wrote in there, you prefer just to hang around with the executives, where Andrew would hang out with everyone in the office. So the two questions are, number one, what did you learn about yourself? And have you changed? Are you still that tough person who Melissa DeRosa writes about in the book? Or have you softened a bit?
Look, I've always, people are not one-dimensional, and one of the things I write in the book is when I was a little girl and I said I wanted to get into politics, my father had this very frank conversation with me. I can still remember it like it was yesterday. You know, you want to be a woman in this male-dominated industry, you know, you're going to have to run faster, jump higher, and never let them see you sweat. And I sort of internalized that from the time I was so young. That's why I got up so early and I worked so late and I knew more than everyone in the room and I read more. And if I was going to get asked a question by the governor, I was going to know the next answer and the next answer and the next answer. No one was going to outdo me. And part of that also meant never showing cracks and never showing imperfections and always having this tough exterior. But as I also write in the book, there were plenty of moments when I closed that door to my office and laid on the floor and cried when I couldn't take it anymore. And so I think that, look, we are all human at the end of the day. No one is one thing. The thing I think I've learned most coming out of this is that the more we all sort of acknowledge to each other that we're not perfect, the better off we all are. And so,
So can you show, are you allowed to show some cracks now? Is that it?
Showing cracks, I think, is actually a strength and not a weakness.
And your mental health now is in much better place than it was years ago.
Look, I'm the strongest I've ever been. And I think that's also part of it. You live through these things, you get knocked down, you get back up. That's when you know what your true character is.
So you have this love of public service. Your dad, who's a great guy, a very well-accomplished guy. He told me the story about your grandmother who made suits and made clothing, and so proud of that. You have a tremendously powerful support system around you. So what's next for Melissa DeRosa?
That remains to be seen, but I love public service, I love government, and
or do you love it enough to be the candidate, or do you want to be the person behind the scenes who often has as much power, if not more, than the candidate? Someone told me at a very young age, it's not that important to know the person. It's important to know the person's person, because that's the one who actually gets things done. Yeah. And I heard that about you through the years. Like, Cuomo will do whatever. If you really want to get it done, you got to get to Melissa.
I'm not sure how you'd feel about that.
Well, but it's the truth, right? I mean, he's out there doing other things, and you're behind the desk getting things done.
No, look, I mean, Andrew Cuomo was behind his desk getting things done too. He is the most active worker as a principal I've ever seen in politics.
Well, I heard you say that the staff was on call 24/7, 365.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, look, as I also say in the book, I never pushed anyone harder than I pushed myself, and he never pushed me harder than he pushed himself. That was just the work ethic in the office. But look, I'm thinking about it. I'm very critical.
Thinking about being the candidate?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I mean, look, I'm very...
I mean, you've seen the ugliness of it all, Melissa.
Well, and you know what?
I just don't know if you're...
And that's the thing. It's like, when you've been put through the ringer like I have, there's something liberating about that. Because it's like they tried with everything. When they've tried with everything they can to kill you and you learn you can survive, it's a very powerful thing. And it just puts things in perspective at the same time. It doesn't upset me anymore. New York Magazine writes a nasty article. Okay, great. And on to the next. You don't let these things bother you the same way once you've been through them before. And there is something very empowering about that. And I love this city and this state and this country. And I'm very critical of a lot of people who are currently in power, and at some point it's put up or shut up, and I know that too. So, I'm thinking about it. I'm looking around at all of this, and I'm figuring out what's next for me, but I'm not ruling it out.
Well, if you want to know who Melissa is, I mean, you are very honest and very vulnerable in the book personally. You spoke about a lot of things personally, but then you spoke a lot of logistics and how the government works. I would love to see you write a book from day one till the beginning of COVID and all. There was a lot of stuff you guys did in all of those years.
Yeah.
And how you get it done and how you negotiate all the different players and all the different and the campaigns and raising money. I mean, you were involved with the Obama administration, the Biden administration. I mean, you even worked with Schneiderman for a little while, right?
I was his deputy chief of staff, and then I was his chief of staff until I got poached to go work for Governor Cuomo. But yeah, no.
It's a pretty good poaching, if I may say so myself.
No, look, and maybe there's time for a sequel. I'm 41, so I feel like
you're a kid. I got socks older than you. Are you kidding me? What's Left Unsaid? My life at the center of power, politics, and crisis. Melissa DeRosa. We're here on 45th and 5th. You can cross the street and go to Barnes and Nobles and pick it up right there. Thank you so much, Melissa. I appreciate you finding the time.
Thank you for having me.
All right.